afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to Seattle First Baptist Church. I am Reverend Anita Peebles. I use she, her pronouns, and it is my honor and joy to serve as pastor of this congregation. Seattle First Baptist Church is delighted to welcome you for this Romney Legacy Lecture featuring Cole Arthur Riley, writer, contemplative, and creator of Black Liturgies. Welcome to those of you joining us in person here in the sanctuary, and welcome to those of you joining us online at seattlefirstbaptist.org or on our Facebook page. We are so grateful for the gift of being together today. Seattle First Baptist Church is a community of faith exploring what it means to follow the way of Jesus together. For us, that means holding strong to our values of affirmation and celebration of LGBTQIA+ peoples, learn how to be anti-racist as individuals and as a community, and understanding that journey is continuous, extending care to those pushed to the margins of society, and caring for our planet through practicing sustainability and educating ourselves and our neighbors as to our fundamental interconnectedness and sacred responsibility to be compassionate stewards of this land. Seattle First Baptist Church is in its 154th year of ministry in the Seattle community. More than 110 of them right here in this sanctuary on this land. And as we gather today, we acknowledge that we are gathering on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish, Stillaguamish, Muckleshoot, Suquamish, and Coast Salish peoples, and that their descendants are our siblings and our neighbors. We are indebted to them for their caretaking of this land. Let us learn from our indigenous siblings as we always continue to care for our common home. So some housekeeping items before we begin. Masks are recommended but not required in this space, and if you would like a mask, we've got some out at this door at the table. For restrooms, an all-gender single-use restroom is located on this level out the back of the sanctuary, and there is a women's restroom, a men's restroom, and an all-gender restroom located on the level below us, which if you're here for the lunch, you can from that level. And you can access that down the stairs at either side of the sanctuary. For the Q&A time, following our speaker, I will moderate using questions that you've written ahead of time on cards in the foyer. And so if you have questions during the lecture, please save them because Cole will be greeting you outside as well, so you can chat with her a bit then. And then also after the Q&A time, you are welcome to greet Cole, and if you have brought your book, which I know many of you have, she will be signing books. Thank you for doing that. And we also have a limited number of books for sale, also outside of the store. So friends, as we gather, may this time be blessed. As we listen to the wisdom that will be shared today, as we reflect and learn together, and as we share this space with hospitality and grace for one another. Thank you for being here. And now I would like to introduce Margaret Norton Arnold, the chair of the Romney Legacy Committee.
Thank you all for being here today. I am chair of the Romney Legacy Committee. Rod was a beloved pastor in our church for many, many years. When he retired in 2000, the Legacy Fund was established and still going strong today. And with me here are my other committee members, including Pastor Anita, Steve Smith, and Diana James. Diana James. Each year we meet and we have a number of, we are told how much we have to spend that year from out of legacy funds, and we try to do our best to balance a variety of needs. One of the criteria in the Legacy Fund is for programs that help to nurture, sustain, and grow our congregational community, and to invite others to come in and be with us. And today is one of those events. This is the first time we'll be hearing from Cole Arthur Riley. She's also preaching from this pulpit tomorrow. And we found that these weekend events are a wonderful way for us to gather, learn, be together, and hearing from someone who They seem to always be popular, and we're going to continue with them. The book, This Here Flesh, is not new, many of you. We also use this during Lent, as Pastor Anita mentioned, and it's been the topic of a number of small group discussions as well. So we come today with some background in this wonderful book, and we're excited to learn more and to hear from our author. To give you just a little bit of background on Cole Arthur Riley, she is a writer and contemplative spiritual leader. She studied writing at the University of Pittsburgh, but traces her love of words and storytelling to her father and her grandma, who are central influences in her writing and her life. Cole is also the creator of Black Liturgies, as Pastor Anita mentioned, a space that integrates spiritual practice with Black emotion, Black literature, and the Black body. Black Liturgies is a project of the Center for Dignity and Contemplation, where Cole serves as curator. Some thinkers who have formed her include Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, James Baldwin, Thomas Burton, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and last but not least, Julian of Norwich. So with that, Cole, we want to welcome you. Thank you so much for being here with us. And I know
What a welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me in your space, for trusting me in your space. It's great to be here. This is my second time in Seattle. And the location couldn't be better for my hotel. The food is excellent. We're going to talk about embodied spirituality today. So what is the spiritual cost of divorcing the mind from the body? And how do we resist a social momentum that's drawing us toward a disembodied life? To begin, I want to take you to a scene, take us to a scene. It's one of the passages of literature that has been most central, probably most central to me in my own reclamation of body, and that's The Clearing from Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. So travel with me. Morrison writes, "When warm weather came, baby Suggs, holy, followed by every Black man, woman, and child who could make it through, took her great heart to the clearing, a wide open place cut deep in the woods, nobody knew for what, at the end of a path known only to deer and whoever cleared the land in the first place. In the heat of every Saturday afternoon, she sat in the clearing while people waited among trees." And Morrison writes after baby Suggs situates herself on this flat-sided rock, she would bow her head, pray silently. The company kind of waited at the perimeter of the clearing, and they knew she was ready when she put her stick down. And she shouted, "Let the children come." And the children run from the trees toward her. And she says, "Let your mother hear you laugh." So the children, ring out with laughter. And the adults look on and they start to smile too. And then she says, "Let the grown men come." And the men step out one by one from among the trees. And she says, "Let your wives and your children see you dance." And so they do, they start to dance, and it talks about the earth kind of coming to life beneath their feet. And finally, she calls the woman to her, and she says, "Cry. For the living and dead, just cry." And the women begin to let loose their wailing, and she says it started like that, the women crying, the children laughing, and the men dancing, until they all got kind of tangled up in each other. And the women, they stopped crying and they started to laugh. Men stopped dancing and sat down, cried, and the children laughing. And they all kind of got tangled up in each other until they collapsed in the clearing. heaving, breath against the earth. It's into that embodied intergenerational practice that she gives her message. Morrison is very clear. She says the matriarch, Baby Suggs, she doesn't give this traditional gospel message. Morrison is very clear. She doesn't tell them to go and sin no more. She doesn't tell them that the meek will inherit earth. She calls them to grace, and the grace specifically in their bodies. This is her sermon. In this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. Yonder do not love your flesh, they despise it. They don't love your eyes, they just as soon pick them out. No more do they love the skin on your back. Yonder they flay it, and oh my people, they do not love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands. She says, this is flesh I'm talking about here. Flesh that needs to be loved, feet that need to rest and to dance, backs that need support, shoulders that need arms, strong arms. She says, oh my people, out yonder, they do not love your neck, unnoosed and straight. So love your neck, put your hand on it, grace it, stroke it, hold it up in all your inside parts that they just as soon slaughter for hogs. And the dark liver, love it, and the beating heart, love it. She says, this is the prize. What is at stake in a disembodied life? So depending on what circles you occupy in recent years, calls to kind of listen to our bodies, to remain in our bodies, I feel like are increasing calls to pay attention to the body. You see this a lot among kind of wellness spaces, wellness influencers, and like the vacuum that is self-care propaganda at the moment. You'll hear, listen to your body, rest, take care of yourself. The message, often valid, necessary, but the why and the how have, I think, in my opinion, become cheapened by a society that equates caring for the body with, like, buying bath bombs and going on luxury vacations, which is nothing wrong with those things. I love those things. But I need to be clear. When I speak about reclaiming the body today, I'm speaking of the clearing. I'm speaking, not like Pilates and going to brunch. I don't mean this diluted form of attunement that often is more about really covering up the cry of the body as opposed to listening to it. I'm talking the clearing. I'm talking raw, earthly, desperate, deeply enfleshed unity of our bodies and the world around us. The clearing that Morrison has offered up and Beloved reminds us that to survive, we must locate a spirituality that has just as much to do with the corporeal, with the physical, as it does one's interior life. So this is my belief. The physical is the spiritual. They cannot be divorced from one another. And I think any disconnect is our society's doing a very strategic reprogramming. Okay, so our society's, rife with exhaustion, enslaved by capitalism, addicted to technology, ill-equipped to care for the traumatized, I think is perpetually training us toward a disembodied life, toward a different path. I think endless cues of self-hatred, disguised cues of self-hatred we receive in our bodies from the time we're quite little, rub some dirt in it, mind over matter, never give up, which is, I think, is the worst of them. Never give up because it can be perceived as this message of integrity, when I think we've all known what it means to give far too much to ask far too much of our bodies. And it's not the voice of tenderness, of self-compassion, of stillness that rises to meet us, but instead it's these mantras, violent mantras, I think, in the end, because they communicate that it's better, that it's more honorable to forget our bodies, usually so that we can produce more for a society that does not care for us. But we're taught that it's better to forget our bodies than to listen to them, than to tend to them. So if you hear little else as I speak today, I want you to hear this, that if you aren't in your body, someone else is. If you aren't in your body, someone else is. Morrison writes, they don't love to see your neck unnoosed and straight. Like with every call, if you listen to that scene, with every call to attend to the body, there's a reminder. She's careful to remind us what's lurking beyond the clearing. Okay, a world that does not care for Black bodies, for queer bodies, for disabled bodies, for bodies disinterested in being ground up and kind of spit out on the altar of productivity and utility. The call to stay in your body begins to ring a little more urgent when you realize that to be absent from the body, it's not like you're just, departing and leaving your body alone. If you aren't in your body, someone else is. It's not a void, it's an open door. Okay, for what? The hands of greed, the face of misogyny, the heart of capitalism, the face of misogyny, the church. There are systems that have everything to gain from our disembodiment because emptied bodies are easier to use. So I mentioned the church in one of those systems, and a few of you gave me an So, maybe you're like, what you doing there? Or maybe you're like, you should have listed that at the top of the list. But I list the church intentionally. I know, it's not often I get to speak in a church setting. I'm typically speaking at colleges. And so I'm grateful to be in a space and be able to speak out of, I've been formed in a Christian tradition. When I was in college, I wasn't raised in the church, but college was kind of my first experience in a evangelical Christian arena. When I was in college, I found myself on a trip to the Dominican Republic with a group of Christians. We rode in cattle trucks through miles and miles of sugar cane and rode to these tiny shanty villages called bateys. In each batey, you find a few dozen Haitian families, typically in indentured servitude, working off some just, undetermined debt. And they were tired, sun-weathered. They had very little access, if any, to medical care because most of them are undocumented, hungry. And so naturally, a group of 30-some Christians showed up to hand out Bibles door to door. And it's night 3 of that trip, and I'm back at the kind of compound where we're staying, and I'm at a table with one of the trip's main leaders for dinner, and I'm sitting back for dinner, which was made by locals, by the way, so fried plantains, chicken and rice, these jugs of lemonade, and I'm sitting at this table feeling all of the interior fraudulence that trips like these tend to stir in a person. And this girl, much braver than I, this girl, she just looks up at the table toward the leader and she says, "It feels cruel." She says, "It feels cruel to show up at a tin door with a Bible and not something real." And the table just quieted. And I've told the story before, and people are like, I don't know, maybe her choice of words was wrong. Some of you might think that, but I think with some degree of compassion, you could hear the words behind the words, right? But this leader, he stops eating and he looks up and he just says, nothing's realer than the soul. Nothing's realer than the soul. And it sounded so philosophical, and so beautiful. But the irony is that the one thing, he said was most real in the world is probably the one thing which, if I would have asked him to, he would have been unable to define it. And, it was still outside of the bounds of his imagination that the soul might actually be enfleshed. And of course, beneath the reality that the soul might actually be enfleshed was a kind of confession that faith that this man allegedly thought would save the soul from, some alleged someday hell was precisely the same faith that contributed to the hellish conditions and degradation of those people in the immediate, degradation of their bodies in the immediate. I hated that trip, and I hate the brand of Christian formation that bore it. And it led me down a path really kind of questioning my own interior world, my connection with the divine. I find it so fascinating that for a faith whose holy text puts so much emphasis on the body, that there are some of us who are trained to neglect it. These are the stories that hold together the Christian traditions. You have a God who walks in a garden with, Adam and Eve. You have the fall leading to Shane's entrance into the world at the sight of Adam and Eve's body. You have, if you're from a Eucharistic tradition, this is my body, this is my blood, right? God born into a body at Advent, God relying on a body. I could talk about this for a while. If you are someone who believes that, if you're someone who believes the story of Mary being the mother of the Christ, how much reclamation, can we derive from this? That God put their faith in a woman's body. That God entrusted themselves to a physical womb. That God drank from the breast of his creation. These are the stories that hold together the Christian faith. It beats blood. And yet, many Christians have been trained in a disembodied faith, or at least a faith whose loudest demand seems to be to sacrifice one's body. How many times will this be said? I suspect some of you have heard it, God endured so much on the cross. God endured so much. What will you give? God gave it all. God gave it all on the cross. What will you give? As if, because Christ endured violence in the body, that our ambition should somehow be to mirror and survive such terror. We are taught in many spaces to sacrifice our bodies for the sake of God, far more than we are ever taught to lie down by still waters, to eat and drink in the valley of the shadow of death, the psalmist says. We have erected this delusion, we're feeding into this delusion with our Christian formation, that the important things are the invisible things. And our task, I think, is to resist this formation, to resist and take hold of the inherent dignity and beauty of physical first. Though it's not an easy task in a traumatized world. So I want to talk about trauma in the body. So what of our disembodiment is the product of things that were done to us? So there are times when to leave the body can feel necessary to one's survival. So what do we do with this? So a lot of research has been done around, the body and trauma. We've learned how shame, and can literally rest on a person's posture over time to transform it. We've learned how trauma changes habits toward bodily neglect, the biological response of dissociating from the body, and the immediacy of trauma, and more research is being released on, the long-term and inherited effects of traumatic experiences in a person's body. I want to share with you a quote from Gabor Mate. He's a Hungarian physician and author, and he writes this: "In the absence of relief, a young person's natural response, their only response really, is to repress and disconnect from the feeling states associated with suffering. One no longer knows one's body. Oddly, this self-estrangement can show up later in life in the form of apparent strength, such as my ability to perform at a high level when hungry or stressed or fatigued, pushing on without awareness of my need for pause, nutrition, or rest." So trauma, in all its forms, trains us toward disembodiment, dissociation. And again, in the immediacy of trauma, this is actually biological mercy. We shouldn't be too quick to dismiss this. There are times when leaving the body is a kind of salvation, a way for the body to distance itself from a present terror. But our task is to not become overly familiar with a disembodied existence, because habitual disembodiment is not a mercy, it's a prison. Now, this research on trauma in the body has begun to extend into research concerning racial trauma, and I want to focus here for a little bit today. What are the stories we inherit? Vietnamese poet and author Ocean Vuong, beautiful writer, in his novel he says, "I'm writing to you from inside a body that used to be yours," which is to say, I'm writing as a son. Which is just, I think, a tender way to communicate that our bodies are a site of intergenerational story, of intergenerational trauma and healing, and how those stories we inherit live in the body today. As a Black woman in America, I'm sure you can understand why such a question is vital for me today. I have inherited a story, and the people in this room have inherited a story of grave violence against the Black body, perpetual neglect, dismissal, and alienation of the Black body throughout American history. And from the time I was a little girl, I learned to divorce myself from my body. I learned to try to transcend my body, transcend my Blackness even, and leave it behind as a form of survival in spaces where I was not welcome. This is not unique to me, by the way. It's very common for many people of color and other oppressed groups. We have had to forget our bodies because to remember them is to subject yourself to daily violence the world heaps on us and our actions and their policies and their beliefs and their language. This is from author Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is from his book, Between the World and Me. He says, "But all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body." So I'll say this, the work of service, of justice, of activism, of existing as marginalized people groups, it lands heavily on our bodies. Every time I have to say Black Lives Matter, it takes something from me. Because I was never meant to need to convince anyone of my dignity. It's costly. It was becoming honest about this that forced me to really contend with all the ways I've learned to view my body by the world, all the ways others' experience of my body as enemy or as inhuman has shaped me. It's inescapable. I'm always hesitant to invoke George Floyd's name in spaces like this. I think, I worry that we're very quickly reducing him to a symbol, and I think his name is used to feed all kinds of emotional emptiness. I don't want to do that, but I need to talk about a man named Donald Williams. So Donald Williams testified in the trial against Derek Chauvin being the man who murdered George Floyd, one of them, and Donald Williams being the man who steadied his hands and filmed the officers and pled with them for Floyd's life. And so Donald Williams takes the stand, and the defense attorneys, they're spending a great deal of time, attempting to imply that Williams was a distraction, that he was adding to the confusion, that he was disrespecting the officers. And at one point, Donald Williams from the stand, I don't know if any of you watched this moment, but he looks up and he just says, no, I stayed in my body. You won't paint me out to be some angry black man. I stayed in my body. And the lawyer just silent, the room goes silent. I stayed in my body. Terrible and beautiful defiance, refusing to be reduced in protection of, another. I stayed in my body. In a world where we are forced to march to rallying cries of I can't breathe, where we are forced to listen to people's last breath, their last words, crying out for their mother and their maker, being I can't breathe. What does it mean to stay in our bodies, to stay near to ourselves, to reclaim, it's not just wellness, self-help fluff. Not for us, it can't be. This is profound resistance and liberation for those of us whose collective breath has been stolen, whose bodies have been degraded. So when I pause, for example, to practice breath prayer, it's a sacred reclamation. It's a reminder that my breath is actually worthy to be nurtured and not stolen. My body is worthy to be listened to. My breath carries wisdom. When I breathe, when I rest, I rest for my grandma and my great-grandma and my great-great-grandma and all of those who didn't have agency over their bodies. When I lie down, I do so for my ancestors who couldn't. I have a strong suspicion that much of the resistance to embodied spirituality in white-dominated spaces, white-dominated Christian spaces, is born of a deep shame of the brutalities that white bodies have wrought in the world. I think whiteness knows on some plane of the soul what it has done to bodies like mine, and to attune to the physical is to become present to the very physical terrors we and our ancestors have enacted. So what I mean to say is our relationship to our bodies, to our own faces, is a story that stretches back long before you were born. And that journey back is costly, but it's necessary. I liken it to like if you ever tripped on the sidewalk or even burned yourself or got injured playing something. And if you've had the experience of kind of not noticing it until you sit down or you look down at your hand and you actually see and confront the mark or the wound, that it starts to hurt, that all of a sudden the burn starts to tingle. This attunement to our physical selves, I think, is often what helps us to point to where it hurts, to sense things about ourselves, our world, our bodies, our needs that we wouldn't ordinarily sense. And time again, I'm reminded that this fidelity to the body is not extraneous to the spiritual life. It's not an add-on. It's actually central. It's primary. So this is what I haven't told you. If you've read my book, you know. But I was 26 when I became sick. It started with something like flu, and then all of a sudden my shoulder started hurting, and then my left arm, and then my other arm, and then my hands, and my cervical spine, until all of a sudden, you know, my husband was feeding me and tying my shoes in secret, and I was left to occupy a body that felt like a stranger to me. So at its worst, I was pretty much tethered to my bed for a year. I would, you know, go to a meeting and come back home and get right into bed, or, you know, sometimes get up to greet at the door and then come back and go to bed. And I would just lie there, you know, just still as ice on my back, and in a time when my body needed compassion and patience and tenderness, I did precisely the same thing that the world does to Black bodies, to queer bodies, to disabled bodies. I turned against it. I thought, if I can't have dignity in my body, I'll at least have it in my mind. I was still in this delusion that the mind is somehow distinct, incredibly distinct from the body. I think I'll just have it in my mind. And so I retreated into books. I would listen to, you know, documentaries, and at a point where there were very little answers about what was happening to my body. You know, I was being poked and prodded and doing swallow tests and neurologists and rheumatologists, and in the absence of answers and in the confines of body that didn't feel like my own, I escaped it. Traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. And I didn't even just feel unsafe, I was terrified. And I used that terror against that body. I turned that terror against the body. In her book, The Body is Not an Apology, a brilliant book, Sonia Renee Taylor, she writes, body terrorism is a hideous tower whose primary support beam is the belief that there is a hierarchy of bodies. We uphold the system by internalizing this hierarchy and using it to situate our own value and worth in the world. She also writes, living in a society structured to profit from our self-hate creates a dynamic in which we are so terrified of being ourselves that we adopt terror-based ways of being in our bodies. I adopted a terror-based way of being in my body. And along the way, you know, you realize I had been neglecting the physical long before I became sick. You know, as a Black woman, I escaped my body to avoid the violence of a world bent on anti-Blackness. As a queer woman, I neglected my body to avoid the ingrained homophobia that told me it was dirty. And as a child who felt a profound sense of loneliness, I escaped my body to survive the rejection of it. And that distance from my body became hatred of it. So fast forward, you know, about a year and a half, and I'm still sick, and I'm at the Cleveland Clinic, which, if any of you are chronically ill, you know, the Cleveland Clinic is where you go when the doctors call you a mystery. So I found myself at the Cleveland Clinic and getting tests, no answers, and I was released the day before my partner and I, my husband and I had planned a trip to Paris. We didn't think we would be able to go on, but I was released. We thought, you know, when you have a choice, choose Paris. And so we went, however, stupidly, and as we traveled, my condition began to deteriorate, and by the time we were in Paris, I had trouble with my legs for the first time. I ended up needing a wheelchair to help me get around. just wasn't very conducive, like the cobblestone streets of Paris. I spent 3 or 4 days of that trip in bed, I would say. I came to Paris to lie in someone else's bed. You know, we were staying at this Airbnb, and one of the mornings, my husband had left to go out and get croissants or something, and I was lying in bed in a particularly desperate state, and I began to pray. Now, you don't know me, so you don't know how strange this is. Because for my work with Black Liturgies, I am not someone who prays out loud, nor am I someone who typically prays organically. If I pray, it's usually in liturgical form, in written form. I don't even know if you could call what I was doing praying. I was like begging. And I began to do it out loud. And it was because it was out loud. It was the first time I was kind of fully confronted with the sound of my interior world turned against my body, and just the vulgarity, the hatred just rang so loudly, you know, saying like, God, if you just take these expletive hands, you know, free me from anything but these expletive legs. And there was such violence, such disdain. And hearing it did something to me, and I remember I was lying there and I just stopped speaking, and I felt something in me kind of jump out in protection of me from me. And I just stopped, and I began to pass the peace around my body. If you're not from a tradition that, you know, spiritual tradition that practices kind of the passing of the peace I don't know if you do this in the Baptist liturgy, but in the Anglican and the Episcopal and the Catholic rites, you have this moment in liturgy where you pass the peace. It's almost seen as a greeting, like it translates that in other liturgies. Often you might shake people's hands, you say peace, peace, peace. And it's so much more than a greeting. In actuality, its placement in the liturgy is very intentional. It comes just before you approach the Eucharistic table and receive the Eucharist together. And it's the symbol of reconciliation, you know, between you and your neighbor. To say, I'm right by you, you're right by me. You know, we're approaching this table together to receive, you know, divine liberation, divine reconciliation together. Beautiful moment in the liturgy. Now, the beautiful part about it for me was that it wasn't really this cognitive exercise that I did in that bed in Paris. Like, I didn't think to myself, well, there's this ancient liturgical practice where they pass the peace, and now I'm going to do that to my body. Like, it truly was instinctual, like a bodily instinct, where I just began to do it, you know. I remember, like, flexing my hands, saying peace, and it was the beginning of my eye issues, the early days of my eye issues. I put my eyelashes against the backside of my hand, peace, my toes, peace, and began to travel around these sites in a body that had absorbed so much hatred from me, from the world, and began to extend compassion. And I wasn't healed. I wasn't. And still, I've known no greater reconciliation to date. And it's not to say that I don't waver. Okay, there are days that take you to places. You know, I've had to become really honest about why having a consensus about what's happening to my body is important to me. I've had to face the real limitations of human genius. I want a name for something that just might not have a name yet. We're so young. Medicine is so young. And I've had to learn to exist in the mystery of a body, in the mystery of a body, and still believe in its dignity. That takes you to places, you know, what you desire, what you fear. Okay. I'm not afraid of going blind. I'm afraid of being seen as obsolete. Okay, it takes you to places. But I've made this commitment that I will not abandon my body. Our task is to remain in our bodies in all of their mystery. their pain, their alienation, their beauty. Okay, what would it mean to stay near to yourself? To stay close to yourself? I want to close by reading a poem. It's a poem that's become a bit of a ritual for me whenever I find myself drifting too far from that in Paris. It's by Vivi Francis, who is brilliant, and it's called Like Jesus to the Crows that gather there along his arms upon the indentation of a slender limb, and not oblivious to human violence, perhaps needed rest, or needed to offer succor of presence despite the stiff collar of their feathers, despite each one being no less the children of a father who claimed an upper realm. It is not true they pecked his eyes, nor did they consider his wounds their own. They were neither irreverent nor quiet. They spoke in the tongues they knew. They cawed full-voiced and would have released him from his bindings had their beaks held the power and had there been time in that place. Like them, I sought to comfort and so be comforted. Like them, I've seen failure, miracles, when they were most needed. Like him, I've called upon those so unlike myself when my father failed to answer. What does it mean to stay near to the body of the divine? To land gingerly on the enfleshed God, even when said presence doesn't ensure relief. We are tired. There are people in this room, that are in a pain in their bodies that they don't even have language for, and that takes you to places. There are people in this room who are waking with an interior fatigue that feels relentless. The answer is not dislocation, but abiding presence. Stay near to yourselves, your whole selves. What is at stake in a disembodied life? No less than our complete and collective liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presence with us, for sharing your stories, and I hope that you heard some of the calling back, because I felt, thank you. I hope that you felt that people were really, that the energy was with you, so thank you.
Yes, I did. You all were very, a very responsive, like facially responsive audience. You don't always receive that, but it helps. It felt more intimate than normal just because you're all looking me in my eyes. This is new.
Yeah. Well, as Margaret had mentioned, we journeyed with your book, Kiss Your Flesh, in our during our Lenten season, and took one of the chapters as a theme for preaching and for worship each day and or each Sunday of Lent, and we started out with breath prayers. And there's a wide range of attitudes about contemplation in this community, and it was uncomfortable for some folks. They're like, we come in, we're singing a hymn, and then we're doing a breath prayer. And we really stuck with it for the Lenten season, and I really loved hearing some of the congregants talk about, oh, that was actually really good. Like, we don't just be. And so as you're talking about like disinvesting from capitalism's hunger for bodies, how do we just be for some moments in the midst of all of that noise and hunger and consumption that is going on.
I think it's a real challenge. I think it takes a lot of courage. So you've alluded to the fact that maybe some people have a harder time with those breath practices. I've become more and more cautious, more and more careful about leading them, because I realized that I led this one workshop, and I at one point I had people practice maybe, I think it was 15 minutes of quiet breath and contemplation, and people, when we gathered back, it was like they were shell-shocked. I'm like, what am I looking at right now? What have I done? And I've begun to realize that silence, and that attention to the body really can take you places, and if I'm not prepared to offer care, if the space isn't curated well and safely, that I can kind of take people into danger that I'm not intending. And so, yeah, I think it takes a lot of courage, because when you pause, when you kind of, even if just for a moment, when you divest from this capitalistic way of viewing the body, when you take your kind of identity, your posture out of doing into being, you're confronted with all of the things that you're confronted with stories, really. I think you become a story-based person. And some of our stories, there are stories that are not safe to go in everyone's presence, okay? So I think, how do we do it? I say carefully and slowly. I was very naive about it, let's say 3 to 4 years ago. I probably still possess some of that naivete, but I think in the presence of the right people, and with a plan to care for yourself. If you find yourself in a story that is traumatic or painful, or, I think it becomes a lot easier to kind of habitually make that journey back to breath, back to body. I'll also say this, the same danger lies, it's not just traumatic stories. For those of us who are chronically ill, who live with any kind of chronic pain, oh man, how I was so naive about this before I became sick. I thought, listen to your body. I was yelling. I was a part of this group of people. I was just yelling at everyone to listen to their bodies. I became sick, and I really had to contend with what I was asking people. When I'm telling a person chronic pain to listen to their bodies, am I prepared to deal with what they're going to encounter on the other side of that listening? Into that tremble in their hand, ache in the lower back. Am I prepared to contend with that? And so I'll say yes. Also that attunement, I think, we have to be careful about, the specificity of the bodies that we're talking to when we communicate those things, instead of some generalized, idealized version of the body that we're asking people to listen to. Yeah.
You're reminding me of a workshop that I went to a few years ago, I think during COVID time, at home times, where somebody used language of if it's comfortable and safe for you, close your eyes. And they were prefacing that, and kind of I see it as recognizing that it's not always a comfortable or a safe thing to practice contemplation in that particular way. And that person was trying to recognize that, and that really meant a lot to me. Yeah. I was really drawn to, in your writing and in your talk today, you talked about tenderness, and it seems like, listen to your body, care for your body, self-care, those things really, they've almost lost their meaning, but tenderness feels different to me, and so I wonder if you would talk a little bit about cultivating tenderness with our own bodies, with people who are around us, be tender with others as well.
Yeah, I wonder if it's something about kind of a Western, even maybe white Western mentality of the rugged individual, the kind of tough, and that tenderness feels so subversive. I wonder if in other cultural experiences it would feel that way. because I gravitate towards that word of tenderness because it feels so unusual to me. To like respond to my body with tenderness feels like something that, you know, is only deserved if I'm not asking for it and if it's someone else imparting it to me, as opposed to the way that I can actually respond to my body. But yeah, I think that word tenderness, or kind of a gentle nature to oneself, is, you know, very countercultural to the lives that many of us are operating in. I think many of us kind of feel like to prepare our children, to prepare young people, we have to like train them to be tough, to be resilient. I'm not that interested in the language of resilience, because I heard someone say once, you know, that people aren't plastic, that they're not meant to bend and return to the original place, which is like the scientific, you know, rendering of the word resilience. But we're training, I think, out of a real love and desire for protection. I think training up young generations to be tough, to be hard, because we know what they're going to have to endure. And what can be lost in the translation of that protection is like there are places where you actually are worthy of tenderness and gentleness, and that the response to the kind of terror of the world, the roughness of the world, doesn't always have to be to harden. It can be to soften. It, again, in the right place, in the right company. You know, where are places where you're allowed to soften? Yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the creation of Black Liturgies in yourself, and when you decided to make it a public space, and how you come up with those contemplative practices, the quote from literature and poetry that you use. How did that come to be?
Yeah, I mentioned briefly I wasn't raised in a religious tradition, but in college I began attending this kind of Presbyterian church. I didn't have much thought about where I would attend church. I went to a friend was like, I think if Christians go to church. I was like, okay, and we quite literally just went to the most obvious church on campus. It happened to be a Presbyterian church, and there's some liturgy there, but it was almost as I fled that space, I found myself in an Episcopal church for the first time toward the end of college, and I majored in writing, English literature, and I found the liturgy so beautiful, like just the writing of it so compelling. I also was exhausted and very depressed, and found a lot of rest in written liturgy, you know, to not have to like come up with, generate the words yourself. Like, I was just sapped creatively and spiritually. There is a kind of rest in liturgy, and that you can just show up and recite the words and belong to something, and belong to something beautiful, I think. And so I was really drawn to that. But I always say, you know, there are days when it's uniquely difficult to pray words written by a white man. And I know what was happening to my ancestors when Thomas Cranmer wrote the Book of Common Prayer. I know what was happening, and those words ring a little differently with that knowledge in the back of my head. And so in the summer of 2020 is when I started Black Liturgies. I was feeling a bit aimless and feeling a bit, I don't know, I was feeling a lot of anger and a lot of disconnect from Episcopal, like, liturgical spaces that for all their beauty didn't feel capable of speaking to Black pain in a credible way, didn't feel capable of speaking Black joy, Black interior life. And so I began Black Liturgies, kind of thinking it would be such a small group of people. You know, liturgy is kind of an odd thing, and I was like, if I can find maybe like a dozen or so Black people who also are interested in kind of the rest of liturgy, and the connection to like Black literature, then I'll be happy during this pandemic. And obviously quickly found that much more than that demographic and that number would be interested in. So the project kind of took on a life of its own a bit. And I think it was a month or so into it, maybe a month into it, I had someone confront me. I'd been writing anonymously because I was scared, and I thought that the best way to be honest would be to write anonymously, and I could say what I wanted to say when I wanted to say it, which I think there was value in that. But I had a friend, confront me. It was like, you're doing a lot of talk about the body, and you completely extracted your body from this project. What are we supposed to do with that? I also had a strange amount of people asking me if I was a white man. And I don't, in my DMs, and I was just getting more and more, confused and irritated by that, why someone thought a white person would be curating that space. And so I decided to show myself. And most days I'm glad that I have, I feel like a different kind of belonging has been nurtured in comments and DMs, and a different level of trust. Can't always trust virtual spaces, but I feel like that community, the names that I see over and over again, there really is a kind of camaraderie or kind of company, spiritual company that I didn't anticipate. Yeah. So if any of you follow Black Liturgies, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. You're kind of touching on this dynamic of personal stories and personal lives and your own embodied life, and then sharing that with like in such a public forum like Instagram and Facebook and just the wide world of the internet. And so in that bringing Black Liturgies to the social media space, and then also in the process of writing your book, it's so personal. How do you kind of find a balance, or how do you think about telling those personal stories of yourself and your family in a public forum where you kind of lose control over them at some point?
Yeah, I mean, it's terrifying. I'm a very private person. I come from a very private family, so the fact that I wrote the book I did is very, very unusual. My father's friends he's known his whole life that didn't know about his addiction until I wrote my book, and I'm so grateful really that my father and my grandma trusted me to go to those places with them, to go to those stories with them, and we're very generous with their trust. I was more inclined to hold back than they were. They kept saying, "Oh, put it in there." My grandma especially, because she's lived a life. Much of it is not on the pages in that book, and she kept saying, "Put that in." And I was like, "Grandma, I'm not putting that in there. You're gonna have to write a memoir, because there's no way I'm letting people into that secret part of her story." And so I felt very protective of her and my father's stories, and had no idea how the book would do or whose hands it would find them in, and I still feel protective. So how do I kind of balance that? Like I said, I'm very private. I've spoken about this before publicly, but I quite literally keep a list of things that I don't disclose to the public, and I have it somewhat memorized, so I don't end up letting so much of myself go. I think over years, if you're speaking in public, nowadays everything's recorded, you give people more and more access, and by the time I'm 60, what will be left for me, that's my own, what will be left for the children in my life, and so I feel preemptively protective. I think a lot about my 60-year-old self, and the kind of charity toward her would be to not disclose everything, but to also be somewhat honest about so it means that I have to be strikingly honest with what I am exposing, what I am divulging. There can't be, withholding has to be very careful, and it can't bleed into that, because this here flesh would seem very fraudulent. They feel very fake, And so I had to say, cool, if you're going there, go there. And then the parts that you need to keep safe, just keep them all the way safe. Don't speak of them. So there are some very loud absences, one of them being my mother, for example, that I'm often asked in spaces like this, the absence of your mother is very loud. Yeah, that's very intentional, for the season of life I'm in. And that's okay. For the most part, people have been okay with that. Yeah.
Thank you. It is a gift to encounter anyone and anybody's stories, and thank you for sharing as much of yourself as you are comfortable with us. It is a gift.
Yeah. Thank you.
In the book and a little bit in your talk, you talked about undoing the whiteness of God and the process of embodiment as related to the memories that we carry and the narratives that shape our lives. And I just wonder if you talk a little bit more about how are those related, memory and the stories we tell about ourselves, and how they can work together as we undo the whiteness of God in the Western imagination.
Yeah, I think the white God does not benefit from good memory. The white God is a terrible historian. That's great for him. Great PR for him is to just have everyone to submit this willful amnesia. And sorry into that kind of quick, but yeah, I think, that forgetfulness, that willful amnesia that our country and really the world, and the majority of the world is subject to, it only serves to distance ourselves from ourselves, distance Black people from themselves, queer people from themselves. I've had to become pretty serious about becoming my own historian. I think, we have to become our own historians. We have to really interrogate who we trust and who we allow in society to be the voice of the historian. And so for me, that resistance at a very practical level looks like a lot of what I did in this here flesh looks like, okay, I'm not a scholar, but I can be the steward of stories in my particular family and in my particular place. And I looked around and I realized, my family doesn't have many artifacts. We don't really have any physical artifacts that we pass down, We don't have much record. We don't have many photo albums. And I thought, what's my role in this, And I'm not, yeah. And I think, what's my role in this? And I think one thing I feel kind of equipped to do is to listen and then to translate stories. I feel like if there's a gift I have, then it's that one. And I think so many of us can do that. So many of us can be kind of asking questions of our elders, can, learning to ask good questions, that not just surface level, for lack of a better phrase, but to really learn how to become good question askers and people who can show our elders that we actually value their stories, that we're not interested in kind of stories that have this kind of neat wrap up at the end, stories that resolve, that we're actually capable of living in the dissonance and that we can withstand that dissonance with them. I had to do a lot of convincing of my grandma, I can hold this, I'm 32 right now, I can hold this. So I think those small kind of everyday gestures of storytelling and story retrieval and story holding can be really important forms of resistance, because like I said, a white God, it doesn't want us to remember. Whiteness in general, it's not all that interested in memory, that it would be terrible or not remembering rightfully. And you'll find, I think, in any oppressive society, the oppressors, one of their most subtle goals is the rewriting. And look at what's happening in Florida. Okay, it's all connected. It's this rewriting and this power, this wielding of power against the story to protect ego, to protect power, all kinds of things. So, yeah, it's a lot of work to resist that.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder if there are, in particular, artists or writers or poets or theologians that you're paying attention to right now? Like, what are you really enjoying? Like in your mind and your heart right now.
Octavia Butler, who I first encountered in college, but I'm having a bit of a awakening right now for just all around prophecy. I think so many Black people right now are reading bell hooks and Octavia Butler at once. And I got chills just now when I said that. Like, I don't know what is in the air, but I am a mystic, so I think it's something mysterious that so many of us, I keep seeing people in buses and just in public, and bell hooks, obviously she passed on, she transitioned, but Octavia Butler, I'm seeing so many people encountering their work. But Butler in particular, I just read Parable of the Sower for the second time, and I'm kind of having a lot of my like mind energy is being spent toward beauty, and beauty not just as resistance, but just beauty that is. Like, it's not in resistance to anything, it's not in defiance to anything, it's just like beauty for beauty's sake. And there are a lot of strange enough beautiful moments in Parable of the Sower. Like, the world is on fire. It's about the apocalypse, the world's on fire, and she has this line, just to paraphrase her, she says, you know, the world is full of terrible stories, sometimes it feels like it's the only one, but I found myself thinking how beautiful that glint of light is through the trees. And it's like this like beautiful, very short, moment, and so I'm thinking about how she does that in her art, how she doesn't reduce Blackness or the world around us to like all pain, but finds a way to translate like beauty and joy and delight in these really dire circumstances. Yeah.
Thank you. And so my last question before we go out and these wonderful folks can chat with you and get to know you a little more is how can people follow your work? What are you working on now, and how can we follow along and cheer you on?
Yes. If you're on social media and it's not eating your soul away, you can follow me on Instagram at Black Liturgies or at Arthur Riley. I'm on Twitter, kind of. I mostly post quotes and poetry there. So it's, but yeah, if social media works for you in this season, feel free to follow me. I have a website as well, arthurriley.com. And right now, I'm working on book number 2. I just submitted copy edits for a book of Black Liturgies. So it's the book that everyone wanted, and they received this here flesh, and people received this here flesh so kindly and so admirably that I felt like a duty, I felt kind of responsibility to like my people. I'm like, you better write this book now. They supported this here flesh, now it's time. So I've curated a lot of Black Liturgies and wrote a lot more, and it's just like a wealth of quotes from Black literature, Black activists, Black writers, and some letters as well that I've written. And yeah, that will be coming out in January of 2024, so I guess stay tuned for that.
Thanks for giving us like a little preview, something to look forward to over the next, I guess like 6-7 months. And thank you so much for your presence among us today, and for being with us in our worship service tomorrow as well. It's an honor to be in your presence and to learn from you and just spend some time hearing from you. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you all.